Good evening. It is a good evening. This is the 28th of February. On this day, in 1968, Aurobindo was founded. And at this hour in Pondicherry, it is the 29th of February, which is known as the Golden Day, the day of the supramental manifestation. We'll have a special program about that tomorrow. We may have something in terms of closing words to say about that later this evening. We've been away from the Life Divine for a couple of weeks while we focused our attention on Sri Aurobindo's book, The Mother, which was published first in 1928. We return to this third chapter, The Eternal and the Individual. I think we'll be able to finish the rest of this chapter over the next 3 weeks. When we last were looking at his argument, he was describing that the absorption of the ascending spirit into the reality of the self is an absorption into the principle of being. The principle of being, as we have learned, as we can experience in our own sadhana, is at one with conscious power and with the experience of its own illimitable nature, which is a delightful experience. So reality, conscious power, and bliss all coexist in reality. They are not separate. So if we withdraw ourselves from the fictional self of ego and implant ourselves back in the reality of that which really is, then why should it be incumbent upon us to deny all expression of power which is natural to being? Why must we say, no, any universal manifestation or any experience of variegation in manifestation and the many possible forms of delight are excluded from that sense of true self? Sri Aurobindo argues against that. Individuals express the power of being in a multiformal way. They are not a denial of being, they are an expression of being. And if we restrict the scope of unity so that all individuality is impossible and the manifestation of the universe is impossible, to maintain that sacrosanct state of being, then we have refused power and we refuse delight. And in other words, we say that Satchit Ananda is not really the supreme description of that reality, but truly it is only Sat. Sri Aurobindo obviously feels otherwise, and the 1,000 years of recent Indian thought is in agreement with him. So let's continue now, picking up this line of argument there. That is not the ultimate aim of our being, an absorption into the silent self. Or the one possible reason would be that in the power, the act of consciousness there is not real union, and that only in the status of consciousness is there perfect, undifferentiated unity. So no expression of power is permissible. Sheer, abstracted consciousness, perhaps aware of itself, could not in any way be expressive, because that would mean the exacting of its power, that it should move, that it should become dynamic. Now, he continues, in what we may call the waking union of the individual with the divine, as opposed to a falling asleep or a concentration of the individual consciousness in an absorbed identity, there is certainly and must be a differentiation of experience. So this possible union of our being as individuals back with the Supreme, with reality, with Sat, need not only be a falling asleep, as if we lapse into a deep trance and have no awareness anymore. We can have a waking union of ourselves in connection with the divine. And if so, a differentiation of experience is permissible. He continues, for in this active unity, the individual Purusha enlarges its active experience also, as well as its static consciousness, into a way of union with this self of his being and of the world being. And yet, individualization remains, and therefore differentiation. So the individual can fuse itself with the cosmos, and in that fusion does not disappear. Simply, it is an enlargement of the scope of one's awareness and activity. The Purusha is aware of all other individuals as selves of himself. He may, by a dynamic union, become aware of their mental and practical action as occurring in his universal consciousness, just as he is aware of his own mental and practical action. He may help to determine their action by subjective union with them, but still there is a practical difference. So he's describing here the nature of that dynamic union. The action of the divine in himself is that with which he is particularly and directly concerned. The action of the divine in his other selves is that with which he is universally concerned, not directly, but through and by his union with them and with the divine. The individual, therefore, exists, though he exceeds the little separative ego. The universal exists and is embraced by him, but it does not absorb and abolish all individual differentiation, even though, by his universalizing himself, the limitation which we call the ego is overcome. So, our first responsibility then, as we grow spiritually aware, is to achieve this personal active communion with the divine. That is the action of the divine in himself that is all important to us. And thereafter, we become universally connected. In other words, move into communion with the wider world and with the deep self which is behind each form in that wider world. But in so doing, we may outgrow and set aside, or at least displace from centrality, the small separative ego. That sense of separation goes away. The universal we move into. We don't become erased by it, though, by connecting to it. Ego is gone. The individual truth in us lives in a vast communion with the universal around. He continues, now, we may get rid of this differentiation by plunging into the absorption of an exclusive unity. But to what end? For perfect union? But we do not forfeit that by accepting the differentiation any more than the divine forfeits his oneness by accepting it. So, as above, so below. Ought we to emulate only the ascetic who claws his way back into the silence of the absorbed self, apart from the universe? What do you get from that? You're looking for a perfect union, but you can have that perfect union in the very stance of action here. You need not leave the world to achieve that depth of union with the divine. The divine manifests the union which is apparent to us in our experience in the whole universe, and that union of the individual within the cosmos, and never loses its sense of what it is. And so that is possible for us too. That is the purpose of yoga, I would argue. He continues, we have the perfect union in his being and can absorb ourselves in it at any time, but we have also this other differentiated unity and can emerge into it and act freely in it at any time without losing oneness. For we have merged the ego and are absolved from the exclusive stresses of our mentality. So yes, that exclusive absorption is possible, but there is no real advantage in it. This idea of a differentiated unity, of course, to students of Indian philosophy will recall Ramanuja's qualified non-dualism, Vishishta Dvaita. So if we're not doing it for perfect union, he continues, then for peace and rest, but we have the peace and rest by virtue of our unity with him, even as the divine possesses forever his eternal calm in the midst of his eternal action. This goes back to the Purushottama's call in the Gita, be like me. Take on my nature, madbhava, become like me. Then, for the mere joy of getting rid of all differentiation, but that differentiation has its divine purpose. It is a means of greater unity, not as in the egoistic life, a means of division. For we enjoy by it our unity with our other selves and with God in all, which we exclude by our rejection of his multiple being. So note what he is saying there. If we drop ego, we may have that responsibility for maintaining this individual self, but we still see ourself and all other selves. All are figurations of that only self that exists. There is only one Purusha, as the mother said once many, many decades ago. There is only one Purusha, Champaklal, in all the world. In either experience, it is the divine in the individual, possessing and enjoying, in one case, the divine in his pure unity, or in the other, the divine in that and in the unity of the cosmos. It is not the absolute divine recovering after having lost his unity, not recovering having lost it. Certainly, we may prefer the absorption in a pure exclusive unity or a departure into a supercosmic transcendence, but there is, in the spiritual truth of the divine existence, no compelling reason why we should not participate in this large possession and bliss of his universal being, which is the fulfillment of our individuality. So again, he stands in contradiction to the Shramanic traditions of Buddhism, Jainism, and Advaita Vedanta, in claiming the universe as a spiritual figuration of divine being, and in so doing echoes several Upanishads, not just the Isha Upanishad. But we see farther that it is not solely and ultimately the cosmic being into which our individual being enters, but something in which both are unified. As our individualization in the world is a becoming of that self, so is the world too a becoming of that self. The world being includes always the individual being. Therefore, these two becomings, the cosmic and the individual, are always related to each other and in their practical relation, mutually dependent. But we find that the individual being also comes in the end to include the world in its consciousness. And since this is not by an abolition of the spiritual individual, but by his coming to his full, large, and perfect self-consciousness, we must suppose that the individual always included the cosmos, and it is only the surface consciousness which by ignorance failed to possess that inclusion because of its self-limitation in ego. Always we were that. And when we take away these shades which cover our eyes and we see what we and all are, there is a reunion of a sort, but a reunion which was never really absent, only we put the shades on. But when we speak of the mutual inclusion of the cosmic and the individual, the world in me, I in the world, all in me, I in all, for that is the liberated self-experience, we are evidently traveling beyond the language of the normal reason. That is because the words we have to use were minted by mind and given their values by an intellect bound to the conceptions of physical space and circumstance, and using for the language of a higher psychological experience figures drawn from the physical life and the experience of the senses. This is indeed the problem. The limits of language have put constraints on every mystic's capacity to express what it is that he, she experiences. Language cannot grasp it because it's founded on materiality, and the beginning of our experience in the world works from the material base upwards. And so we move from the material by analogy into the worlds of life and mind and find that they connote something, but they are not perfect conveyances of what one's experience is. And founded as they are on specific experiences, they have specific meanings which become generalized, subtilized, etc. And so they do yeoman service, but they are by no means the language of the divine. We need a language that is more plastic to the Spirit's intuitive touch and demand. We have it not yet. He continues, but the plane of consciousness to which the liberated human being arises is not dependent upon the physical world, and the cosmos which we thus include and are included in us, not the physical cosmos, but the harmonically manifest being of God in certain great rhythms of his conscious force and self-delight. Therefore, this mutual inclusion is spiritual and psychological. It is a translation of the two forms of the many, all and individual, into a unifying spiritual experience, a translation of the eternal unity of the one and the many. For the one is the eternal unity of the many, differentiating and undifferentiating itself in the cosmos. So he speaks here of a link of the eternal and the individual, and that is, of course, the title of the chapter, the eternal and the individual. Oneness is never lost prior to the manifestation, and it is not lost during the manifestation. This means, he writes, that cosmos and individual are manifestations of a transcendent self who is indivisible being, although he seems to be divided or distributed. But he is not really divided or distributed, but indivisibly present everywhere. This was cited at the opening of the last chapter, Brahman Purusha Ishwara. This is Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, verse 17. Therefore, all is in each, and each is in all is in God, and God in all. And when the liberated soul comes into union with this transcendent, it has this self-experience of itself and cosmos, which is translated psychologically into a mutual inclusion and a persistent existence of both in a divine union, which is at once a oneness and a fusion and an embrace. So that speaks to the dynamic range of possibilities, founded upon oneness, which is never lost, a fusion moving back together, having seemingly been divided, and an embrace, a recognition that I want to hug that because I love it, I am that. So soul and cosmos are one, fused friends and lovers. The normal experience of the reason, therefore, is not applicable to these higher truths. Therefore, we will not follow logical constraints here, because that is the imprimatur that philosophy places upon things, on a system of reasoning, if it coheres logically. But the reason has no right to speak to what is true in these higher experiences. It has no experience of them. Its laws do not hold sway there. In the first place, the ego is the individual, only in the ignorance. There is a true individual who is not the ego and still has an eternal relation with all other individuals, which is not egoistic or self-separative, but of which the essential character is practical mutuality, founded in essential unity. So the true individual is not the constructed vehicle that we find in mind, life, and body, shaped thusly. Its essential character has a practical mutuality founded upon unity. So from that deep unity, mutuality, leaning into individuality, you see. So the individual is never abstracted from the vast collectivity, not really. Always the individual rises from that mutuality. It's the manifestation of the many from the one, which is the root of the cosmos. He'll make this clear. This mutuality, founded in unity, is the whole secret of the divine existence and its perfect manifestation. It must be the basis of anything to which we can give the name of a divine life. But secondly, we see that the whole difficulty and confusion into which the normal reason falls is that we are speaking of a higher and illimitable self-experience founded on divine infinities, and yet are applying to it a language formed by this lower and limited experience, which founds itself on finite appearances and the separative definitions by which we try to distinguish and classify the phenomena of the material universe. Again, the problem of language in rendering the ineffable, the inexpressible. Thus, we have to use the word individual and speak of the ego and the true individual, just as we speak sometimes of the apparent and the real man. Evidently, all these words, man, apparent, real, individual, true, have to be taken in a very relative sense and with a full awareness of their imperfection and inability to express the things that we mean. By individual, we mean normally something that separates itself from everything else and stands apart, though in reality there is no such thing anywhere in existence. It is a figment of our mental conceptions, useful and necessary to express a partial and practical truth. But the difficulty is that the mind gets dominated by its words and forgets that the partial and practical truth becomes true truth only by its relation to others which seem to the reason to contradict it, and that taken by itself, it contains a constant element of falsity. So this fictional separation of ego, this fiction in part is what Buddhism and Advaita seek rightfully to destroy, to get rid of that fiction. It does, in our conscious growth, separate us from the real truth. We may differ about ultimate ends, but to dismantle the ego and not allow it to be chief in the self's presentation in the world is key to spiritual growth. It is, if I may say, interesting that Sri Aurobindo, who is clearly a master of language, should be underscoring again and again that the limitations of language delimit him from expressing what is this. No tongue can utter it. No mind is large enough to conceive it. One can experience it in the depths of one's being, and then to come back and give it adequate expression. If Sri Aurobindo can suffer frustration from that. Thus, when we speak of an individual, we mean ordinarily an individualization of mental, vital, physical being separate from all other beings, incapable of unity with them by its very individuality. That's the ordinary notion of individuality. If we go beyond these three terms of mind, life, and body and speak of the soul or individual self, we still think of an individualized being separate from all others, incapable of unity and inclusive mutuality, capable at most of a spiritual contact and soul sympathy. So it is, he's speaking here about how the mind, in looking at the experience of a deeper self, still conceives of each self being separate. Sankhya will say that each soul is a separate soul. Each Purusha, and there are endless numbers of them, is different and separate from the others. They are not somehow combined together. They're like billiard balls. They stand apart from each other on the billiard table. It is therefore necessary, he writes, to insist that by the true individual we mean nothing of the kind, but a conscious power of being of the eternal, always existing by unity, always capable of mutuality. It is that being which by self-knowledge enjoys liberation and immortality. And this being the definition of the true individuality, you can see that it does not insist upon that self-discovery being extracted from the cosmos into an absorptive identity with the divine, which annuls the world. To know what you really are means that you have experienced liberation, you have found what is immortal in you, but You exist by unity with what? With all around, in the manifestation, and always capable of mutuality. What you experience is shared. It is mutual with others. You are not separate. What you do has an impact. What they do has an impact upon you. But we have to carry still farther the conflict between the normal and the higher reason. When we speak of the true individual as a conscious power of being of the eternal, we are still using intellectual terms. We cannot help it because we cannot help it unless we plunge into a language of pure symbols and mystic values of speech. But what is worse, we are, in the attempt to get away from the idea of the ego, using a too abstract language. Let us say then, a conscious being who is, for our valuations of existence, a being of the eternal in his power of individualizing self-experience. For it must be a concrete being and not an abstract power who enjoys immortality. And then we get to this, that not only am I in the world and the world in me, but God is in me and I am in God, by which yet it is not meant that God depends for his existence on man, but that he manifests himself in that which he manifests within himself. Did I read that correctly? Mm-hmm. But that he manifests himself in that which he manifests within himself. Yes. The individual exists in the transcendent, but all the transcendent is there concealed in the individual. So he's getting to the reality of Sat as substance. He says that the individualizing self-experience of the eternal is what is the individual, and it is concrete. It has substance, it has weight, it really exists, and it enjoys immortality. But this is not simply an experience that we find in mutuality with the world around. World and self are one, but also we find ourself in God in us. But God is not limited by that. He remains free, does not depend for his existence on us, but he manifests us within himself. And he's using God here to stand for the transcendent, because the three terms he's talking about quite evidently are individual, universal, and transcendent. So they are all one. Further, he says, I am one with God in my being, and yet I can have relations with him in my experience. Aha! So one can arrive at identity with the divine and still continue in the mutual interplay in the universe, and as an individual conducting business in the world, have relations with the divine, and even discover the divine behind all those relations in the other figures with whom one relates, and in the forces and energies transferred between. Evidently, we have arrived at certain primary relations of the Absolute, and they can only be intelligible to the mind if we see that the transcendent, the individual, the cosmic being are the eternal powers of consciousness. We fall again, this time without remedy, into a wholly abstract language of an absolute existence, a unity, yet more than a unity, which so expresses itself to its own consciousness in us, but which we cannot adequately speak of in human language and must not hope to describe either by negative or positive terms to our reason, but can only hope to indicate it to the utmost power of our language. This experience of the liberated individual at play with others in the world, at once one with the transcendent, at one with the cosmos, awake and aware in the individual, is his actual experience. And so too, the actual experience of the mother. Thus, linguistic failure should not disprove or discount his philosophic stance. We know what we're speaking about, even if we can't make the words capture it. But the normal mind, he writes, which has no experience of these things that are so powerfully real to the liberated consciousness, may well revolt against what may seem to it nothing more than a mass of intellectual contradictions. It may say, I know very well what the absolute is. It is that in which there are no relations. The absolute and the relative are irreconcilable opposites. In the relative, there is nowhere anything absolute. In the absolute, there can be nothing relative. Well, we're launching here a long paragraph in which common sense and strict logic argue against this inclusive experience which Sri Aurobindo has just lengthily described. Anything which contradicts these first data of my thought is intellectually false and practically impossible. These other statements also contradict my law of contradictions, which is that two opposing and conflicting affirmations cannot both be true. It is impossible that there should be oneness with God and yet a relation with Him such as this of the enjoyment of the divine. In oneness, there is no one to enjoy except the one, and nothing to be enjoyed except the one. God, the individual, and the cosmos must be three different actualities. Otherwise, there could be no relations between them. Either they are eternally different, or they are different in present time, although they may have originally been one undifferentiated existence and may eventually re-become one undifferentiated existence. Unity was perhaps, and will be perhaps, but it is not now and cannot be so long as cosmos and the individual endure. He's having fun writing this. The cosmic being can only know and possess the transcendent unity by ceasing to be cosmic. The individual can only know and possess the cosmic or the transcendental unity by ceasing from all individuality and individualization. Or if unity is the one eternal fact, then cosmos and individual are non-existent. They are illusions imposed on itself by the eternal. That may well involve a contradiction or an unreconciled paradox. But I am willing to admit a contradiction in the eternal which I am not compelled to think out, rather than a contradiction here of my primary conceptions which I am compelled to think out logically and to practical ends. I am, on this supposition, able either to take the world as practically real and think and act in it, or to reject it as an unreality and cease to think and act. I am not compelled to reconcile contradictions, not called on to be conscious of and conscious in something beyond myself and world, and yet deal from that basis as God does with a world of contradictions. The attempt to be as God while I am still an individual, or to be three things at a time, seems to me to involve a logical confusion and a practical impossibility. End quote. Well, Sri Aurobindo replies, such might well be the attitude of the normal reason, and it is clear, lucid, positive in its distinctions. It involves no extraordinary gymnastics of the reason trying to exceed itself and losing itself in shadows and half-lights or any kind of mysticism, or at least there is only one original and comparatively simple mysticism free from all other difficult complexities: total absorption. Therefore, It is the reasoning which is the most satisfactory to the simply rational mind. Yet is there here a triple error: the error of making an unbridgeable gulf between the absolute and the relative, the error of making too simple the rigid and extending too far the law of contradictions, and the error of conceiving in terms of time the genesis of things which have their origin and first habitat in the eternal. Now, the argument will unfold itself. We'll go one paragraph farther and we'll stop for the evening. We mean by the absolute something greater than ourselves, greater than the cosmos which we live in, the supreme reality of that transcendent being which we call God, something without which all that we see or are conscious of as existing could not have been, could not for a moment remain in existence. Indian thought calls it Brahman. European thought the absolute, because it is a self-existent which is absolved of all bondage to relativities. For all relatives can only exist by something which is the truth of them all, and the source and content of their powers and properties, and yet exceeds them all. It is something of which not only each relativity itself, but also any sum we can make of all relatives that we know, can only be, in all that we know of them, a partial, inferior, or practical expression. We see by reason that such an absolute must exist. We become, by spiritual experience, aware of its existence. But even when we are most aware of it, we cannot describe it because our language and thought deal only with the relative. The absolute is for us the ineffable. Ineffable, that which cannot be expressed. So we'll put our bookmarks there. Since we're on the verge of the 29th of February here in America, and it is already the 29th of February in India, a few hours yet away from the actual evening time celebration, because this occurred in the Wednesday class, in the evening, in the playground, that this descent of the supramental into earth, which Mother called the supramental manifestation, occurred. There's a sentence that she read that night from the synthesis of yoga to the class assembled with her. I'd like to read it if I could. This descent, this sacrifice of the Purusha, the divine soul, submitting itself to force and matter so that it may inform and illumine them, is the seed of redemption of this world of inconscience and ignorance. She said these words, she had that vision, and then the thing occurred. We'll talk about that event tomorrow, and we'll send an invitation to our friends on Zoom as well if they'd like to attend our evening discussion in Pensacola. It'll be at 6:30 our local time. I will make bold to read to you the message of the Golden Day. In Pensacola, I'm early. The step from man towards Superman is the next approaching achievement in the Earth's evolution. There lies our destiny and the liberating key to our aspiring but troubled and limited human existence. Inevitable, because it is at once the intention of the inner spirit and the logic of nature's process. This is taken from something Sri Aurobindo wrote around 1930, which was not published during his lifetime. The message for 29 February, the day of the Lord, the golden day. We'll conclude, as we always do, or we always try to do, with a passage from Savitri. Book 11, the Book of Everlasting Day. The soul's choice and the supreme consummation. Some shall be made the glory's receptacles and vehicles of the Eternal's luminous power. These are the high forerunners, the heads of time, the great deliverers of earth-bound mind, the high transfigurers of human clay, the firstborn of a new supernal race. The incarnate dual power shall open God's door, eternal supermind touch earthly time. The Superman shall wake in mortal man, and manifest the hidden demigod, or grow into the godlight and God force, revealing the secret deity in the cave. Then shall the earth be touched by the Supreme. His bright unveiled transcendence shall illumine the mind and heart and force the life and act to interpret his inexpressible mystery in a heavenly alphabet of divinity's signs. His living cosmic spirit shall enring, annulling the decree of death and pain, erasing the formulas of the ignorance, with the deep meaning of beauty and life's hid sense, the being ready for immortality. His regard crossing infinity's mystic waves, bring back to nature her early joy to live, the metered heartbeats of a lost delight, the cry of a forgotten ecstasy, the dance of the first world-creating bliss. The immanent shall be the witness God, watching on his many-petaled lotus throne, his actionless being and his silent might, ruling earth nature by eternity's law, a thinker waking the inconscious world, an immobile center of many infinitudes in his thousand-pillared temple by time's sea. Then shall the embodied being live as one, who is a thought, a will of the divine, a mask or robe of his divinity, an instrument and partner of his force, a point or line drawn in the infinite, a manifest of the imperishable. The supermind shall be his nature's fount, the Eternal's truth shall mold his thoughts and acts, the Eternal's truth shall be his light and guide. All then shall change, a magic order come, overtopping this mechanical universe. A mightier race shall inhabit the mortal's world. On nature's luminous tops, on the spirit's ground, the Superman shall reign as king of life, make earth almost the mate and peer of heaven, and lead towards God and truth man's ignorant heart, and lift towards Godhead his mortality. A power released from circumscribing bounds, its height pushed up beyond death's hungry reach, life's tops shall flame with the immortal's thoughts, light shall invade the darkness of its base. Then in the process of evolving time, all shall be drawn into a single plan, A divine harmony shall be earth's law. Beauty and joy remold her way to live. Even the body shall remember God. Nature shall draw back from mortality, and spirit's fires shall guide the earth's blind force. Knowledge shall bring into the aspirant thought a high proximity to truth and God. The supermind shall claim the world for light, and thrill with love of God the enamored heart, and place light's crown on nature's lifted head, and found light's reign on her unshaking base. A greater truth than earth shall roof in earth, and shed its sunlight on the roads of mind. A power infallible shall lead the thought, a seeing puissance govern life and act, in earthly hearts kindle the immortal's fire. A soul shall wake in the inconscient's house. The mind shall be God vision's tabernacle, the body intuition's instrument, and life a channel for God's visible power. All earth shall be the Spirit's manifest home, hidden no more by the body and the life, hidden no more by the mind's ignorance. An unerring hand shall shape event and act. The Spirit's eyes shall look through nature's eyes. The Spirit's force shall occupy nature's force. So, for tonight.